Vintage Pokemon cards launched a billion-dollar empire. Though how did these super simple designs end up becoming some of the most iconic Pokemon cards ever made? The truth is, Pokemon cards were never meant to last. Pokemon didn't expect for it to become a worldwide franchise that competes with megaliths like Disney and Hello Kitty. And they didn't expect fans to become so connected with the trading cards. Early Pokemon trading cards were created to literally capitalize on the insane early hype of Pokemon. I mean, Pokemon as a franchise was so heavily associated with collecting, trading, and capturing Pokemon that collectible cards fit their brand identity perfectly. However, that's why in this video, I want to go over why you'll actually never regret owning vintage Pokemon cards, and I'll also reveal what I believe the future holds for vintage Pokemon cards throughout this video as well. Though vintage Pokemon cards are far more than just collectibles, they are literally pieces of history, and they always will be because they were the starting point for Pokemon cards. While there was other variations, the early vintage cards are what really started Pokemon cards to get on the trajectory of where they are today. Though in terms of why you'll never regret owning vintage Pokemon cards, the first reason is they are part of Pokemon's history. Don't take this part lightly because you really need to think of this in other franchises and in terms and make like comparison points to others. When you think of Disney, just imagine if you had trading cards or some form of collectibles from the 1930s when the original Disney animated films came out. How powerful would they be for their time period? How nostalgic would they be? How revered and collected would they be? Well, we kind of do have that with Pokemon because Pokemon released, in the 90s, but these vintage Pokemon cards are literally part of their history. Don't forget, when Pokemon released, they didn't really expect it to be as big as it was. Once it came out, it literally became a flywheel for how much it grew in popularity. Pokemon became a worldwide phenomenon. Everyone and every kid was playing Pokemon games and collecting the Pokemon trading cards. It really took it to another level. When Generation 1 released, no one knew if there was going to be a Generation 2. And little did Pokemon know that by releasing Generation 1, they'd also make it all the way to Generation 9, which we're on currently. And that's why when you own vintage Pokemon cards, you are literally owning a piece of history from this time period. And not in just like a monetary kind of thing, but you are owning a piece of history from one of the biggest franchises to ever exist. And don't forget, vintage Pokemon cards are not coming on the market anymore. Whatever you find of vintage cards now is only what's left out there. It is going to be very, very rare for more high quality vintage cards to be coming on the market because sure, there's some packs that are still going to be opened, but when you really look at it, what's kind of out there now, we are slowly getting to a point where it's going to be far less more new cards coming on the market that are being opened from these old vintage packs. Now, the second reason for why you'll never regret owning vintage Pokemon cards is because vintage Pokemon card population reports are actually alarmingly low compared to modern. Now, pop reports are a big buzzword when you think of collecting Pokemon cards and the like, okay? Because pop reports are kind of where everyone kind of establishes how rare cards are versus how many there are in the market. Now, don't actually get fallen into the trap that pop reports are everything because yes, while they matter a fair bit, they're not actually the be all and end all. For example, when we look at Moonbryon, which is one of the most popular modern Pokemon cards in the world, that has a huge pop report in terms of its price. But there's very few Pokemon cards that have a PSA 10 pop report like Moonbryon and have the value. And even outside of Pokemon, you don't have this in sports collecting or anything where it has such an astronomical amount of PSA 10s and still fetching the price point that it does. But when we look at vintage, the reason why pop reports start becoming a little bit more enticing, but when you look at vintage cards, there's really not that many PSA 10s or high grades, especially when you compare it to modern chase cards. Now here's the thing with modern Pokemon cards, okay? When you look at the pop reports like the Charizard from 151 or the Venusaur from 151, wherever you're looking, when you look at the pop reports of these cards and then you compare them to vintage chase cards, it is night and day. So we could argue that vintage cards are far more rare. Now what happens here, and this is why it's always a little bit confusing for a lot of collectors, vintage Pokemon cards were far easier to pull. The difference is that when someone pulled a vintage card, it usually went in their pocket, it went into lunch boxes, it went into binders that weren't even protected, and they would actually get played with and used. Whereas with modern Pokemon cards are far rarer to pull, they're far more difficult to pull, but because it's very established that they're difficult to pull, How do collectors look after them? They sleeve them straight away. Though when you look at more in-demand vintage cards, if they do have low pop reports and they have high demand, you are really sitting on a good future for that card. Now also, while speaking about these vintage cards and owning some of these grails, if you do want to buy and sell some of these, this does bring me to today's video sponsor, which is Misprint. Now, Misprint is a US-based website which allows users to buy and sell Pokemon cards at community-driven prices. Now, Misprint actually stands out a lot because it allows sellers to have an option for immediate liquidity. As you can see with Misprint, it does have a buy now feature along with a sell now price. Buyers on Misprint can put in offers for cards and products that they are willing to pay, and if the seller is happy, the sale can happen immediately. Misprint also has a feature which allows you to scan multiple PSA slabs, and it provides details on their current market prices, which is super useful for card shows, or if you just need to get quick market updates. As the Pokemon hobby continues to grow, having a community-driven tool like Misprint really makes a big difference, as it's literally a website built on the Pokemon community. Now, if you do want to try Misprint out, you can actually get $5 off your first purchase by using my referral code. Honestly, a big shout out to Misprint for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back into it. Now, another reason why you'll never regret owning vintage Pokemon cards is because they were never treated like investments. Vintage Pokemon cards were treated like toys. They were traded, literally stored in shoeboxes. I mean, when comparing this to modern, it's a huge contrast. Modern cards are sleeved instantly and often put straight into top loaders, and that's what I mean. The kind of psychology of the collector has really gone through a transformative shift over the last few years, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, because vintage cards were just treated exactly like what they were used for. They were toys. Sure, some kids played with them, but at the end of the day, collecting Pokemon cards, especially back in the 90s and early 2000s, it was a big status symbol when you were at school. You would show your rare cards, but you would definitely bring them to school to show everyone. But at the end of the day, these would all get damaged. Now, like I mentioned before, they were easier to pull. But at the same time, you had so many people collecting these cards. You had so many people trading them, so many people just touching them, that finding these vintage cards in high quality is very rare. And because they were never seen as investments, okay, we have gone through this shift because a lot of the millennials that collected these as kids have grown up, and then now they look back at that and they go, wow, Pokemon cards were awesome. I can't wait for these cards today to become valuable in the future. Now, there's always this big debate, okay? You'll always hear and say, vintage cards are so in demand now because, no one knew that they were going to be rare, so they're so unique for that. And modern Pokemon cards will never really go to those levels because, everyone collects them right now. Though that doesn't always mean that's the case, because modern Pokemon cards still have a high amount of desirability, and they're also much more popular in terms of a global outreach right now, and in terms of how many people are collecting. But in terms of these vintage Pokemon cards, the fact that they were never treated like investments does give them a bit more of a unique edge, because if you do find them, or if you can get these graded, it really does become a bit more attractive for the people in the market. Now, honestly, that's a big reason why I love collecting vintage cards in higher grades. And when you kind of learn vintage cards, it's actually a very different market. Not in terms of just the Pokemon cards, but even what people desire. PSA 10s in vintage are very expensive, but also don't forget, they're very rare. Now, because of this, vintage cards, sometimes PSA 9s, PSA 8s, even in some circumstances, PSA 7s and PSA 6s, like for example, Gold Star cards, they're still desired. But whereas in modern Pokemon cards, if you have a PSA 6 or a PSA 7, that's really nowhere near as desired as other cards. So understanding the differences with the market's really important. Now, another reason why is because you will never get artworks like vintage Pokemon cards ever again. When we look at vintage cards, we can clearly see how unique the artworks are. And I mean, even some cards like, the original Vaporeon, that kind of looks a little bit off-brand. It doesn't exactly look like a perfect Vaporeon artwork. Because they were getting released for this new audience and Pokemon didn't know how big it would become, they've got these artworks that are so unique to them. But there's something really bizarre about vintage cards. Whenever you look at one, it's almost all millennials can literally recognize all of them. And if you actually just go through every vintage Pokemon card, and if you go on a website and you just look through them, especially the original base sets, and you go through them, you'll actually be able to see and you'll be like, oh my gosh, I remember that card as a kid. It just spikes your memory whenever you see one of them. You're like, oh, I haven't seen that image for such a long time. And it's so bizarre how it kind of gets trapped into our memories. And I think I'm not sure whether modern cards will have that same effect like vintage. The big reason for that is because not many kids and collectors will actually have the experience of owning a lot of the rare modern cards. With vintage collecting, I can guarantee, especially like with base set, a lot of people saw Charizard from base set. A lot of people saw Blastoise or Venusaur. A lot of people own them themselves. They weren't that rare. Like for today, it's actually really rare that someone's even going to see an Umbreon from Prismatic Evolutions in person unless they maybe go to a card show. But the chance of seeing like that Umbreon from Prismatic Evolutions because your friend owns one is actually getting rarer and rarer. But back with vintage, everyone knew someone that had a Charizard. You may have had a Charizard yourself. Everyone knew someone that had the Blastoise. You would have pulled the Venusaur. It just became a thing you actually owned, and you actually have those core memories established. And because of those artworks, they really made these imprints in the brain that I just don't feel that modern Pokemon cards are replicating in the same way. Now, I'm a big modern collector. I really love collecting modern Pokemon. But at the same time, when I look at vintage, they just do this thing where they just stay in the memory a bit better. And I don't know, is that the reason because, you know, people collected these themselves? Like, is that what's actually going on? But there is something very unique about the artworks that I think, even though the modern Pokemon artworks are far more in your face and they're probably a bit more interesting, they still don't carry that same weight like these old school vintage artworks. Now, something to actually understand is that vintage Pokemon cards have legitimate historical significance for Pokemon. And I think that gets lost along the way because, like I mentioned, right, Pokemon didn't expect it to become what it was today. So they do have this real historical recognition. They have this thing where they are part of history. And I kind of feel like the momentum always swings. So for example, within 2024, vintage Pokemon cards were crashing across the board. They just weren't that interesting. More people wanted modern Pokemon cards. But right now there is a shift. Right now, vintage Pokemon cards are heavily in demand. The kind of pendulum has swung more in demand for vintage cards. But here's the thing, as the years go on, I always see vintage Pokemon cards will always have demand. It's almost close to impossible to kind of squash that because they were the first of its time. Whenever something for a franchise is the first in line, it's always going to be remembered as iconic. When you look at this, they are part of history. They have far more historical significance than any of the modern Pokemon cards today. Sure, we've had a second kind of golden boom with Pokemon cards right now, but the Pokemon cards of today just cannot compete in terms of the historical significance. And even in 50 to 60 years, they won't be able to do that because these old school ones are the first in line. This was Pokemon's training phase. But you know what's really cool about vintage Pokemon cards? When you look at the back of a vintage card or you look at the back of a modern card, they're identical. So they actually have had some things stay the same. Sure, the borders have changed. Sure, the artworks have completely changed. We've introduced full arts and alternate arts, and there's so many more flashy rarities. But in terms of the framework and how Pokemon cards were created, a lot of that tradition has stayed the same. I know a lot of you watching my channel, you guys know I'm in filmmaking, okay? One of the best books in filmmaking was written in 1950s. And you know, it's still used today. The reason why it's still used today is because the lessons and the frameworks within that book are timeless. And that's kind of what vintage cards are as well. Vintage Pokemon cards in their own way are timeless. They are forever pieces of history for Pokemon. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I truly believe vintage Pokemon cards will become highly iconic pieces of history that no one will ever forget. I think they hold a very special place for people, and I always like to link this to early Disney, as I mentioned before in the video. If Disney had early collectibles when they released and they were popular, just imagine the prices of these today. They would be worth millions, and I can see vintage Pokemon cards in that same light. Vintage Pokemon cards will always be desired for that reason alone, because they were the first ever in line and the first kind of trading cards to ever make such a big impact. I mean, Pokemon has a weird way of preserving its history. And actually, they've done this before because even in early Pokemon video games, Pokemon always cared about preservation. I mean, Pokemon always cared about being able to trade Pokemon from generations. For example, a Pokemon that lived in a Game Boy Advance game was able to get traded to a Nintendo DS game and so forth. And it's funny because you can actually see me trade a Pokemon all the way from the GameCube from 2002 all the way to a modern Pokemon game in 2025. And I actually take that journey within this video here. Within this video that's appearing on screen, I go over the journey of sending a Pokemon from Pokemon Coliseum all the way to Scarlet and Violet. If you love vintage Pokemon cards and you love vintage Pokemon games, then watch me take this journey on my second channel called Philip's Trick Room. Click the video on screen and I'll see you on the next video.